Mr. Corsi, BLM received public comments urging your agency to examine the impacts that the hydraulic fracturing rule was going to have on states. The comments called on the BLM to conduct what is known as a federalism assessment under Executive Order 13132. BLM responded to the comments in its final rule. The final rule says the BLM believes that there will be no financial impacts to the states as a result of this rule. It goes on to say that the BLM does not believe that production from federal lands will be reduced as a result of this rule. Therefore, a federalism assessment, it says, is not required. So did the BLM rely on any empirical data to show that a rule of this significance would not reduce oil and gas production on federal lands?
So we can provide you an answer on the federalism assessment. It's a fairly specific corner of the rule, but we would be happy to get back to you on that.
Because we'd like for you to submit any data that you used as part of the hearing record that might have been look at that, because we're just trying to figure out the basis of BLM's statement that the rule will not reduce oil and gas production on federal lands. For most of us, we think that's hard to believe, and trying to figure out what helped you come to that conclusion. So.
Well, I do think, if you don't mind me taking a second, I do think there's an interesting narrative that federal regulation drives away investment. We have places like in the Marcellus Shale where there's an abundance of natural gas opportunity, but also significant infrastructure. So we have seen development of natural gas move to areas like that. And in places like Wyoming that are rich in natural gas, there's been a decline. But it doesn't mean that those resources won't be developed when there's more resource. I think it's more the market reacting to whatever's happening today. But there's also an interesting counterexample where, if you look at where BLM rules apply, they apply to both public lands and to tribal lands. And on tribal lands, during this administration, there's been an almost 500% increase in oil production. And so that's under the rules that the federal government has. You've seen almost 500% increase. And so I think that tells a story of where there's significant opportunity, you will see significant production.
I would say, as chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee, there have been 500%. Could be 5 times the amount of a very little amount, just a little bit more, because we continue to hear significant stories of inability of on the Indian tribes and on Indian reservations opportunities to actually use the resources because of additional impact of federal regulations, making it that much harder to use significant amounts of resources that are there. So I'd ask Mr. Watson, you've been 31 years at Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Do you believe that this rule is going to have a negative impact on oil and gas production on federal lands?
Oh, it definitely will, and I've already seen it with the delay in permitting.
Ms. Sakama, what are your views on the same thing? With all your experience, do you believe the rule will negatively impact oil and gas production on federal lands?
Absolutely. There's just so many additional requirements on federal lands and so many different policies that have been put in place over the last several years that are slowing development on federal lands and just making it more difficult. Our members continually tell us that they are they avoid at all costs federal lands.
In an answer to a previous question, you said something about you hardly ever see a situation where more red tape and regulations make things actually easier. If you could actually find any time that they've made things easier, if you could submit that for the record, I think that would be a...
I'll do some research.
Thank you. Don't waste a lot of time, though. Thank you. Mr. Watson, in your testimony, you discussed the variance process. I understand that a state may apply for a variance if a state's own hydraulic fracturing rule meets or exceeds the objective of the BLM's rule. You explained that a variance does not give a state authority to enforce its own rules on federal lands. Instead, a variance allows the BLM to apply alternative or additional regulations to its final rule. This brings a whole new meaning to the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished. So if your understanding of a variance is correct, does the state of Wyoming have any incentive to obtain a variance?
Not for Wyoming. There'd be no incentive at all.
Okay, so Mr. Corsi, would you like to comment on that?
Well, You know, if the state of Wyoming and the Bureau of Land Management are in the midst of discussions, and so, you know, the reports I've gotten out of that are general in nature, but there's a sense that they've been productive and that Wyoming is pursuing these conversations in potential pursuit of a variance.
Mr. Watson, I understand the oil and gas producers in Wyoming are already taking steps to avoid federal oil and gas. And specifically, oil and gas producers are establishing what are known as spacing units, which include private and state lands, but exclude federal lands. So would you discuss this at greater length for the committee?
Okay, so a spacing unit just defines the area that one well will drain, and it includes federal, state, and fee. So we see a lot in the examiner hearings, which I've done a lot of, where the actual well bore, at one point, there'll be federal lands, and they'll just cut that out. So they basically, we call it spacing them out. Or, for instance, the east half might be federal, the west half is fee. They'll just space the west half and just leave the feds out. So I see that all the time.
Ms. Sagama, in your testimony, you tell us the actions of the Department of Interior over the last several years lead us to the conclusion that the real goal is to discourage responsible energy development on federal lands, that pushing it to adjacent private and state lands or to areas of the country that are not predominated by public lands. Would you please expand upon your comments for the committee?
Well, we've just seen several policies that really are not furthering the goal of more oil and natural gas development on federal lands. I mean, I think we can all agree that we want them done in environmentally responsible manner. We feel that we've achieved a balance by providing quite a large energy resource while disturbing a small percentage of public lands. So some of the policies include leasing reforms that have added additional layers of NEPA and additional delays in the leasing process. We have seen land use planning restrictions in resource management plans amendments that leave us scratching our heads trying to think how we can possibly operate in areas when there are so many overlaying regulations. You can't even find a month in the year that there isn't something that's keeping you off development. And those are going to get worse when the sage-grouse amendments come out. We've seen installed project environmental analysis. There's several projects in Wyoming, for example, that are in the 8th year, and there's just no end in sight or no plan for moving those NEPA documents. Recently, we've seen very hostile retroactive audits based on new interpretations of the regulations. And we've seen things like more acreage being put off. I mean, the latest example is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where 12 million acres is now going to be considered for oil and gas development. And now, as you mentioned, we've got a new rulemaking process on increasing the royalty rate. I mean, when you've already made it so much more expensive to operate on federal lands, and your break-even point is so much higher on federal lands because of all the additional costs, you know, raising the royalty rate simply will make a lot of development uneconomic.
Thank you. Mr. Cornsey, I understand the BLM examined state hydraulic fracturing regulations as it developed its final rule. BLM reviewed existing regulations in Wyoming as well as California, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. And according to the BLM, these states accounted for 99.3% of the total oil and gas wells completed on federal and Indian lands from 2010 to 2013. Do you know which, if any, of these states had actually failed to regulate hydraulic fracturing in a sufficient manner?
Well, as noted earlier, you know, we were looking for best practices. We have 32 different states that have oil and gas leases that we have oversight responsibility for. And so we drew from many sources, including many states, like the ones you mentioned, for those best management practices to lay down a basic common sense standard that should apply nationwide wherever federal lands are drilled on.
Well, I think it's disappointing to people here that are listening in on this that we can't really get an answer to the question from the administration of which of these states doesn't measure up. It doesn't seem that the administration can find fault in the state hydraulic fracturing regulations of any of these states. So I mean, that to me says that the BLM's final rule is redundant and unnecessary. So that's, I think that's the kind of a thing that Senator Lee made reference to of a solution in search of a problem. But I do have one additional question. The BLM has not yet issued a final environmental impact statement for an oil and gas project in Wyoming, I think, since 2008. And it's now 2015, so BLM has not issued a final environmental impact statement for oil and gas project in Wyoming since 2008. Currently, there are 9 environmental impact statements for oil and gas projects in Wyoming pending with BLM. I know you haven't been there the whole time, well aware of that. Some of these impact statements have been, pending with BLM for 8 years. I think it's inexcusable for any federal agency to be in that situation. So do you have any idea when we can expect BLM to issue some of these final environmental impact statements for these projects?
So I'm glad you asked this question. The governor's office has raised the same issue with me. So I have looked into it. We do have those 9 projects that are moving forward. About half of those came in the last 2 years. And so we're talking about one of the exciting things about Wyoming and the oil and gas realm on public lands is we have 100,000 wells nationwide that we have oversight responsibility for right now. There are almost 40,000 that are going to come online through these 9 EISs just in Wyoming alone, right? So we're very much leaning forward into the process. Continental Divide Creston is probably going to be the first one to come through that system. So we expect some progress on that and 1 or 2 other major EISs this year that will speak to thousands and thousands of additional wells in Wyoming.
Thank you. And Mrs. Gama, do you see these sorts of delays in any other states?
Utah's the other state with several projects being held up.
Okay, thank you. Well, without any other members here, I appreciate each of you being here today to testify, to share your insights. The hearing record will stay open for 2 weeks. Some of the other members of the committee who were not able to be here today may supply additional questions in writing, and I'd hope that you would be able to get back to them with answers in a timely manner. Thank you, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.